Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. We'll start the program in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Good day, everyone. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's new digital platform that will enable you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, AJC International Director of Interreligious Affairs, Rabbi David Rosen. Rabbi Rosen, who has been described as AJC's ambassador for Judaism to the religions of the world, is here this afternoon to give an overview of the global interreligious scene today, including AJC's involvement in global interfaith relations. He will also review Jewry's main relationships with the Christian world, in which AJC has played such a leading role, and will report on and assess recent historic inroads with the Muslim world. After we hear from Rabbi Rosen, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Rabbi Rosen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, for the kind introduction. Hello to everyone. Obviously, it's a little presumptuous to give you an overview of everything that's taking place around the world in the field of interfaith relations and AJC's involvement in it. By definition, the time constraints mean that this will be partial, but I hope it will give you, my presentation will give you a very good taste of the extent of our engagement. Indeed, interfaith relations in the world globally is arguably the most remarkable untold success story of our times. Never before in human history has there been more communication, understanding, collaboration, cooperation between religions than there is today. One wouldn't get that impression from reading newspapers because it's basically good news, and that's not what boosts rating or sales. But it is a remarkable story, and AJC's role in that story has been and still is really very significant, if not unique. It goes back, of course, to the very foundation of the organization, with the wisdom of understanding that religion is often part of the problem, certainly with regards to a history of anti-Semitism, but that the solution is not to avoid religion, but to engage it and to make it part of the transformation. In addition, there was also an understanding fundamental to, if you like, AJC's DNA, that if one wants to advance the well-being of one religious minority, you will succeed in doing that far better if you promote the interests of all religious minorities, and therefore the whole field of interfaith engagement, interreligious understanding ultimately benefits the Jewish community. The initial outreach in the early part of the 20th century was first and foremost to the Protestant communities in the United States. Perhaps one particular notable historic reference is the establishment in 1927 of the National Conference of Christians and Jews that AJC played a significant role in, and indeed throughout most of the history of that organization until eventually it disappeared. AJC was involved in the holding of biannual conferences promoting Jewish Christian understanding. But inevitably that acquired a far broader global significance as the world both became a smaller place and as AJC's need to engage the world beyond the confines of the United States expanded. And there were very significant opportunities in that regard. Inevitably, these were galvanized by the impact of the Second World War, the impact of the Shoah, the impact also of the Shoah on the Christian world, because while the Shoah was not exclusively a Jewish tragedy, but was disproportionately and overwhelmingly a Jewish tragedy. It was overwhelmingly a Christian scandal. It was perpetrated in ostensibly Christian lands by ostensibly baptized Christians, and that led to very significant reformulation. In the meantime, time was marching on, and there was a recognition, obviously, within certain traditional institutions that there was a need to address the modern world and its changes. And that particularly impacted upon the Catholic Church with the beginning of the papacy of Pope John the 23rd, who convened the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council. As a result of the remarkable relationships that had been built up by AJC with the Christian interlocutors, and the particular role of Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, who had the responsibility for interreligious affairs, and who was referred to by Newsweek in 1970 as the Jewish apostle to the Gentiles, AJC played a very special role in interlocuting with the Holy See at those significant formulative moments as the Second Vatican Council sought to address its relationship with the Jewish people. And that developed a very extensive area of AJC's engagement with the Catholic Church, the Catholic communities worldwide, but especially with Rome. At the same time, AJC was actually the first of the Jewish organizations to reach out to the World Council of Churches and held a conference in 1968 with the collaboration of the Secretary General then at the time, Dr. Eugene Blake. And then also to the Orthodox churches, and thus AJC played a significant seminal role in the formation of an umbrella organization to represent Jewry to other world religious bodies known as the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. Rabbi Tannenbaum was one of the first chairmen of these. I have twice been chairman of this organization. Today, Rabbi Noah Marans, my colleague, is chairman of this organization. And so in terms of both the Jewish representation as well as in terms of how the Christian world responded to these changes and to its own desire to reestablish a more positive and healthy relationship, or to establish a healthy, positive relationship with the Jewish people, AJC has played really a very, very special, as I say, if not unique, historical role. Today, AJC's standing at the Vatican is, I think, demonstrated in the fact that, for example, in the Synod on the Middle East, the Jewish voice came from AJC in addressing how the church must respond to the challenges of the contemporary Middle East situation today. Similarly, in 2015, when there was a document released on the 50th anniversary of the document that had changed this whole relationship, 1965 Nostra Aetate, the document In Our Times, which repudiated the idea of the deicide charge, or that the Jewish people had been rejected by God, and condemned anti-Semitism. On the 50th anniversary of that declaration, a new document was released, a very significant document, and AJC was there invited to respond to it, highlighting our very special profile with regards to, above all, the Catholic Church, but indeed beyond throughout the Christian world. I'll refer to some other relationships a little bit later, but the motivation is something that I think one needs to look at as to what was the importance and what is the importance of interfaith relations globally. And the first and obvious fundamental impulse, which has been implicit in what I've already been speaking about, is the need to be able to combat prejudice and bigotry and to promote friendship and understanding. And this challenge has a wide spectrum from, if you like, social engagement of various kinds to the more rarefied academic and theological encounters and dialogue, which again AJC has led very significantly also in terms of its publications, but above all in terms of the conferences and colloquia that it has advanced throughout the modern history in the interfaith movement. The second area, which is becoming more and more significant, and in recent times has tended to even dominate the field of interfaith relations globally, has been the area of collaboration for the common good. That is, pursuing common interests. Not least of all amongst these is the question of religious freedom itself, the ability for people to freely express their own particular traditions and heritages, advancing human dignity. That is, of course, first and foremost, the sanctity of human life itself. Then in recent times, we have had what are now, in terms of their more modern incarnation, are known as the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which address the whole spectrum of human well-being in our times and have increasingly engaged religious institutions to advance these needs. And I'll refer again a little bit to that further on. But these things cover issues like protecting our environment and ensuring that we have a home to live in, combating slavery, trafficking, various aspects that are evils in our world that are, of course, an offense to human dignity and well-being, combating poverty, advancing human health, and recognizing that religions are disproportionately the delivery system. One of the recent Pew studies indicated that 84% of the world defines itself in religious terms. That might not so much be in North America and in Western Europe, but for the vast majority of the world, religion is the central institution of people's lives. And therefore, if you can access the churches and the mosques, you have the vehicles by which you can actually contribute to productive development and sustainability in societies in a disproportionate way. And so this has become more and more the focus of global interfaith collaboration and cooperation, particularly also through the engagement of central institutions and leadership, as we've seen from the Christian world, whether it's been the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew or Pope Francis, even Pope Benedict before him, and even John Paul II. We're also focused upon these needs of how religion addresses both environmental, social, and ethical issues, and the need for collaboration to those ends. So just overviewing the global scene, and whereas I can't deal with all the different organizations, the history of the global interfaith movement is very often traced to 1893, where in Chicago, the first so-called Parliament of World Religions took place. There was also a gathering of World Faiths, Congress of World Faiths in London in 1936. But really the impetus, as I already mentioned, came with the Second World War and in the wake of the Shoah. And the first international body to be established, which was not multi-faith, but specifically bilateral, was, if I'm not mistaken, was the International Council of Christians and Jews, established in 1947, which again, AJC played a very special role in setting up because of its own involvement in the National Council of Christians and Jews in the National Conference of Christian Jews in the United States. AJC has been very significantly involved in this ICCJ, the International Council of Christians and Jews, which now embraces, I think, 40 different countries, and also has an Abrahamic forum for advancing Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations. But it was really, in terms of multi-faith initiatives, if I'm not mistaken, the most significant development took place in 1970 with the establishment of the World Conference of Religion for Peace, now known today as Religions for Peace. This embraces today some 90 countries, has regional councils, both lay bodies as well as councils of religious leaders, to be able to engage the different communities around these issues of combating violence, overcoming conflict, promoting peace, assuring, as I say, sustainable well-being for societies at large, and addressing what today are now called as the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll refer to a previous incarnation of that in a moment. The Parliament, which I referred to in 1893, was, if you like, resuscitated a century later. And since then, since the 90s, has been meeting every 4 or 5 years, as opposed to Religions for Peace, which is very much an organization that brings establishments and institutional structures together, even though it's often through the grassroots activity. The Parliament is very much an open market, which takes place where all people who are interested in coming and gathering are able to participate, and some might even say it contains everything from the sublime to the ridiculous. But it was, and to a large extent has been, a sporadic gathering, and thus there was room for a more ongoing structure to come in place, and that was took the form, in particular in the year 2000, of the URI, the United Religions Initiative, which is a global grassroots organization. That same year, a very significant event took place in New York, and that was the UN Millennium Summit of World Religious Leaders. The first time brought religious leaders from all the different religions from around the whole world together at the United Nations for the Millennium Year. And a number of significant developments were required for this, not least of all the establishment of a representative body for Hinduism, because it's such a diverse, enormous, if you like, civilization. And it was in order to participate in this international gathering that All India Dharmacharya Sabha was established as a Hindu roof body. I'll come back to that in a moment. AJC had a very high representation as a Jewish voice within this Millennium World Summit. There was Rabbi James Rudin there, Martin Kaplan, who at the time was the head of Interreligious Affairs, was focusing already then on religion and environmental issues. And this Millennium Summit gave opportunities for engagement up in a real global manner, albeit in a one-time event. The person who was the Secretary General for that event was a gentleman by the name of Bauer Jain, who'd been a friend of mine for many years, and who was very happy to be able to utilize these contexts to advance different relationships between different religious communities. And thus, coming out of that, we had the first Hindu-Jewish summits in New Delhi, and then in Jerusalem, and then subsequently United States. These summits were very much stimulated and supported, if not to a degree initiated, by the government of Israel, where its foreign ministry understood that diplomats and politicians come and go, but if you can establish a relationship between the religious cultural bedrock of societies, you have a much more sustaining relationship that can be more creatively leveraged to advance the needs of the respective communities. So here you see another area where the, if you like, political interest in the most noble sense of the term also interfaced with the Interfaith initiative, simply to be able to advance understanding, greater recognition, to overcome prejudice and bigotry, and to advance relationships between the two communities. As a result of these Hindu-Jewish summits, which AJC was one of the major sponsors of these gatherings, and also another one with the Dharma religions generally that took place in Israel. We were also able to access communities from Muslim communities that we did not have access to before. We had various contacts with communities from, if you like, more moderate contexts, such as Morocco and Indonesia. But we were able, as a result of our engagement with the Hindu communities in India, to have outreach to the Muslim community there. And there are more Muslims in India than the whole of the Arab world all put together. And as a result of those initiatives, we were able to bring Muslim leaders of the All India Association of Mosques and Imams, which involves more than 500,000 Imams, to bring their leadership to Israel as well. However, the next stage, if you like, of advancing the whole spectrum of interreligious engagement, in particular in relation to the Muslim world, came as a result of September the 11th, 2001. 9/11 was not only a shock and a trauma globally, but of course for the Arab Muslim world, it was a particular challenge in terms of the way Islam was being presented, and also out of a recognition within the Muslim world that even if there was a threat here to the Western world and to other religions, the threat was first and foremost to moderate Islam itself. And there was a need not only to be able to address those challenges, but to work together with other religious organizations to stand up against this particular threat. And so there have been a number of different initiatives. Jordan has played a particular role with declarations like the Amman Declaration in 2004 or the Common Word in 2007. It was behind an initiative at the United Nations to establish a week for interfaith harmony and understanding that takes place every first week of February that the United Nations embraced. There were other initiatives that took place, perhaps notable ones were also in Qatar with the establishment of the Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue. But perhaps some of the most remarkable initiatives in recent times from the Arab Muslim world that AJC has had a unique position and role in have come from the UAE, from the United Arab Emirates. Today, there are 3 particular agencies coming out of the UAE. One was perhaps the major one established under the auspices of the foreign minister, was the Forum for Peace in Arab Lands, which is first and foremost a pan-Arab Muslim and therefore global Muslim entity to be able to advance the well-being of society at large and minority rights, but in recent times has reached out more and more in terms of its interfaith work, headed by Sheikh Abdullah bin Baer, who is now, if you like, the Supreme Mufti or the head of the Supreme Fatwa Council of the UAE, and that was also behind the initiative, together with Morocco, to issue the Marrakesh Declaration, affirming the freedom and the rights of all groups, all religious communities and minorities within the Arab Muslim world. And in addition, the UAE has now a Ministry for Tolerance, and also an interfaith alliance that comes out of its Ministry of Interior. And these have unparalleled outreach to the Jewish community, which we never saw ever before to the same degree. There is also a relationship with organizations like the New York Board of Rabbis, or with the Conference of European Rabbis, and AJC. It has a very special role within these particular relationships coming out of the UAE. But arguably the most dramatic initiative coming from the Arab Muslim world came from Saudi Arabia in 2008, from the previous king, the late King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, establishing ultimately a center in Vienna together with Austria, Spain, and with the Holy See, with the Vatican, that is known as CAICID, initials for the King Abdullah International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue. But while it's an intergovernmental organization, is nevertheless managed, directed, like policy determined by an interreligious board of 9 people, 3 Christians representing the Vatican, the Ecumenical Orthodox Patriarchate, the Orthodox world, the Archbishop of Canterbury, 3 Muslims, 2 Sunni, 1 Shia, 1 Hindu, 1 Buddhist, and I happen to be the Jew. But that's quite remarkable that at the time, the Saudis were willing to be able to have a rabbi from Israel be part of that particular body that was established. CAICID does certain remarkable work in terms of its programs, but for me, it's been the opportunity to be able to meet, above all, the opportunity to meet and engage religious leaders, especially from, if you like, the hardcore Arab Muslim world, that I will not normally have the opportunity to do so. Amongst those who I met was Dr. Mohammed Abdul Karim Al-Isa, the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, and that relationship was able, if you like, to play its role in a very significant development that came again through the man I mentioned before, associated with that Millennium Summit at the United Nations, Bauer Jane. And thus, together, we were able to establish this relationship between AJC and the Muslim World League, or more specifically with Dr. Al-Isa, that resulted in this remarkable mission to Auschwitz that took place just a couple of months ago in Poland, that AJC led, being led by our executive director, David Harris. And the impact of that visit upon Al-Isa himself, but also the other Muslim Arab leaders that he brought with him to that gathering, was enormously significant, as well as the ability to be able to celebrate our respect for one another and even celebrate Shabbat together that took place in Warsaw subsequent to that. As many of you may know, just a few weeks later, I was able to be in Saudi Arabia as part of this board of CAICID, the King Abdullah International Center, albeit established by Saudi Arabia, but none of the board meetings had ever taken place before in Saudi Arabia. This was the first time that we were actually invited to Saudi Arabia, and that is a sign of the times as to how this interfaith relationship, and there are many other examples I can give you, has actually impacted upon changes that have taken place within that society. And we were received by King Salman, the King of Saudi Arabia, the first time ever that an interfaith delegation had been received by him, let alone a rabbi from Israel. So that was quite significant and is very much reflective of all these different inroads that we've been able to make and a role we've been able to play within the framework of our global interfaith work. Perhaps I would just conclude by referring to the fact that all governments today have understood that wisdom that AJC understood from its inception, that religion really is part and parcel of the fabric, not only of societies at large, but of political realities, and that it needs to be engaged. And so we've had more and more governments establish offices and departments for engagement with the different religious communities. And AJC has been uniquely positioned with regards to those outreaches that have come from various governments. One of the most notable of those has been the German government in recent times. But of course, in 2013, John Kerry established a specific office for religion and global affairs in the State Department, where he indicated that the goal was to expand understanding of religious dynamics and engagement with the religious actors. The understanding is that interreligious relations is not the solution in and of itself for all the problems of the world, but it is an enormously significant component. And by engaging the work of religions in global advancement of combating prejudice and bigotry, advancing tolerance and understanding, and above all, in advancing the sustainability of society, which is now referred to in the United Nations as the Sustainable Development Goals, religion can play a key role in ensuring that the well-being of humanity and of society can be advanced. And in this role, AJC not only positions itself as an organization in a very special place, but also serves very much to represent the values and the heritage of the Jewish people as a whole. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, David. We have a lot of questions, and a few of them, actually, I'll put into one question. The Vatican recently opened its archives during the World War II period. Are there any new revelations from that development?
Well, I can't tell you because I haven't yet looked at the archives, and the scholars are lining up to do so, and therefore it will be many years ahead before we are really able to discover whether there are any revelations in these materials that have not been accessible for independent scholarly review until now. Father Hoffman in the Vatican, who is the point person for relationships with the Jewish people, said that there will be no smoking gun. Not quite sure how he could prophesy that, but I think it's likely that he's correct. I don't think there's anything that will really be able to demonstrate anything radically dramatic. I think we will get more knowledge about what the Vatican did, especially with regards to the fate of Italian Jewry, the Jewish communities in Rome, what positions it did take, how much assistance was proffered through Vatican agencies or not. The big argument, of course, refers to the personality of Pope Pius XII. And the argument between his defenders and his accusers is to a degree a hypothetical one. Pope Pius XII did not speak out to condemn the Nazi policies, and above all with regards to the Jews and the extermination of the Jewish people. His defenders said he did that because he knew he wouldn't achieve very much if he did it, and if anything, it would reverberate destructively upon the church, and it would do more harm than it would do good. Obviously, from a Jewish perspective, that very idea that there could be any more harm than good is almost unpalatable thought. At the very least, saying something during those terrible times would have provided some succor for the victims of the Nazi extermination. Perhaps even more dramatic is the fact that after the war, there was no word from the Pope, no mea culpa, or no sense of responsibility, or no even expression of regret that we couldn't have done more. So the debate in the end remains a hypothetical one. If he would have done what he could have done but didn't do, would it have been different? And we're not going to really resolve that question. I don't think any Vatican documentation will resolve that. If we are responsible, we will recognize for the Jewish people, nobody can be described as saint during those times unless he or she actually laid their lives down in order to be able to save people at that time. And we must need to understand that for the Catholic Church, a pope is not just another guy. And therefore there is a genuine feeling within the church that this is a man blessed with divine understanding who made a legitimate, if not in some people's eyes, justified tactical decision. So if we are really responsible, we will learn to agree to disagree with regards to our judgment on that terrible period.
Our next question comes from Peter in New York. He asks, these days, when Jewish interreligious news makes it into major media, its relations with Muslim communities, while incredibly important to transform the Muslim-Jewish relationship, what are the frontiers of Jewish-Christian relations in the 21st century?
Yes, I mean, I think that the assumption there is a very important one. The challenge that came from the Christian world was a far greater one that came from the Muslim world from a historical point of view. The Muslim world never delegitimized us in the way the Christian world did. They never presented us as killers of God, in league with the devil, the enemies of God, And therefore all the conspiracy theories that existed within the Middle Ages were not commonplace within the Muslim world. It doesn't mean everything was a picnic within the Muslim world, but it was far better to be a Jew in the Muslim world than it was to be in the Christian world during the Middle Ages. The irony is that while the Christian world has to a very large degree purified itself of that terrible burden of anti-Semitism throughout most of its history, obviously not entirely, but to a very significant degree, these canards and these myths, these anti-Semitic ideas have undergone an Islamification within the Muslim world. And that obviously has a much more existential significance, especially for Israel, but also for the Jewish world at large. And indeed, what happens to Islam in relation to the West is of significance for all of us. We all have a stake in ensuring that the Muslim world is able to purify itself, as Christianity has done, of those negative elements and to become a more constructive element within Western society at large. However, despite those positive changes within Christianity, there are still many issues that need to be addressed, not least of all with regards to the Christian world's understanding of what Israel means for the Jewish people. This is more of a challenge with regards to the mainline Protestant denominations than it is with the Catholic Church, and obviously the issues with the evangelicals become different ones. So if you like, the general challenge is how to be able to instill deeper understanding of the different ways we define ourselves and our different understandings of our own religious and cultural identities.
We have a question from Peter Gross, who asks, how do we address the widespread problem of anti-Jewish incitement by imams in mosques around the world?
We address it by being able to, first and foremost, in the classic way, which is the classic way of overcoming evil is to do good. And therefore, the more we can spread positive understanding and collaboration and cooperation, the more we can combat those negative distortions. I didn't have time to go into more details with regards to all Kaisid's activities, but one of the most significant things that it has done in recent times is the establishment of the Muslim Jewish Leadership Council in Europe. That is the first time there's ever been actual collaboration and cooperation between rabbis, between religious leaders and imams, sheikhs within the Muslim community in Europe. Part of that collaboration is born out of simply pragmatic need, like a lot of those global interfaith initiatives that I mentioned have come out of enlightened self-interest. But that enlightened self-interest, if we can capitalize on it, enables us to change distorted perceptions of the other. So here in Europe, there is a need for religious freedom for issues, whether it has to do like keeping kosher or eating halal food, or whether it has to do with head coverings or head scarves or religious symbols like that, where there are, and certainly combating incitement and defamation, where there are interests that each community has for its own needs. And if we can get the communities to work together to understand that those own particular needs are in fact common needs and have a broader consequence, we can have a much broader impact upon those society at large. So I think the real angle in terms of the whole area of interfaith relations, both locally and globally, is finding those angles that serve the enlightened self-interest of each community and find ways in which we collaborate so that our collaboration serves each one's respective interests, but ultimately as a result contributes to the well-being of society at large.
Our next question comes from Bruce in Ohio. Can interfaith activities between religious leaders have any real effect on solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or is that just in the hands of the political leaders?
So as I said earlier, I don't think that political conflicts can be resolved by religious players in and of themselves. I have colleagues, some very famous ones, who do believe that religion can bring about a resolution of the conflict, and specifically with regard to the Israeli-Arab conflict, not just with regards to the Palestinians, but to the Arab nations around at large. Personally, I think that's a little naive. However, even though the conflict between Israel and Palestinians is not a religious conflict in essence, it's a territorial conflict. I'm happy to elaborate upon that if anybody has reservations in that regard. Nevertheless, it involves people with identities, like most conflicts in the world, and those identities tend to be rooted within cultural, and generally cultural means within religious heritages. And therefore, these heritages are used or abused in order for self-justification, to be able to advance my interests, and very often to delegitimize the other and to reduce their own claims in some form. This, as a result, the religious dimension becomes important. And therefore, engaging in constructive dialogue between Jews and Muslims and also Arab Christians is not in itself able to provide the solution, but can be a very important support when there are political initiatives to bring about a resolution. In fact, it's a great source of distress for me that in all the initiatives that have taken place over recent times, religion has not been engaged. There's almost been a perception that because religion is often abused in a destructive way, the intelligent thing is to avoid it. I can understand that, but that's a complete canard, because if you don't engage it constructively, it will come back to haunt you. And I think we saw that both with the rise of Hamas and of Islamic Jihad, and even of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. These extreme elements were encouraged by the failure to engage the moderate voices of both Judaism and Islam. If you don't want the extremists to capture the public consciousness, then you need to ensure that the moderate mainstream voices are engaged in terms of visibility and support for political initiatives. So religion needs to be used or engaged constructively to support political initiatives. I don't think religion can do it by itself, and I'm not sure I would even want it to be able to do it by itself.
Our next question comes from a listener in London who asks, most of the billions of Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others will never meet a Jew. It's amazing to hear about your work with religious leaders from around the world, but how can we make sure that the good work of interfaith understanding impacts the grassroots?
Indeed, that's the big challenge for us. And here's the irony. AJC is the only Jewish organization that has a department for international interfaith relations. The only Jewish organization. There are organizations that have local positions in terms of interfaith, but to have a department for international interfaith relations, we are the only ones. So the first thing the Jewish people should be doing is making sure that more resources are put into this field, and that we have therefore more personalities and more resources out in the field, as it were. But thank God we also live in an age of modern technology. And one of the brilliant initiatives that AJC has recently done has been through this initiative of People of the Book, of presenting about the Jews, and therefore videos that have gone out to the Arab world to be able to overcome canons, misrepresentations through the Arabic language of an understanding of our religion and of our heritage. So we can use technological tools far more effectively today than ever before. But again, if we can target the key international bodies that I've referred to and ensure that we are encountering major leadership, people who are multiplicators, who engage with sometimes millions of adherents, we can have a significant impact. And as Mao Zedong said, if you'll excuse me being a little bit trite, every journey of 100 miles begins with one step.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Howard in Michigan, who's asked if is there any religious communication and collaboration with Iran religious leaders?
There are contacts, first and foremost, through Kaisid. I've been able to meet a number of Shia leaders, primarily from Iraq, but also from Iran. But I have also met through other bodies before individuals. By definition, the kind of religious leaders I will encounter do not represent the establishment, and they tend to be a little more marginal. There are initiatives that are taking place. There are certain entities in the United States that are working on track 2, even from Norway, that have engaged certain elements of which naturally I'm well aware of. We haven't been involved in those initiatives. And to a large degree, I would say these are initiatives preparing for the day after, for when things change, that there will be those addresses and leaders who can be constructively engaged to advance things in a new era.
I think we have time for a few more questions. Our next question comes from a board member in Chicago who asks, AJC has said that Muslim-Jewish relations is the next major interreligious project. What lessons can be drawn from AJC's experience in Christian-Jewish relations and applied to Muslim-Jewish relations? And aside from religions themselves, what are the main differences to keep in mind on engaging with these two religions?
So I would say that the most important lesson we can draw from our incredible success in overcoming the prejudice and bigotry and anti-Semitic and anti-Judaic teaching that existed within the Christian world to the degree that we've been able to do. And of course, as I've already said and acknowledged, there's still plenty more to do, has been brought out of the fact that we did not stand on our high horses we did not play shy it would have been perfectly legitimate. And in fact, there were voices within the Jewish community coming particularly from my own denomination within Orthodoxy, within the Jewish community, that said, there's no point in reaching out to the Gentiles, especially not to the Christians. They are irredeemably anti-Semitic, and until they change their theology, we don't want to have anything to do with them. And if we would have taken that particular approach, we would not have had the incredible achievements of the transformation that came with the document Nostra Aetate in 1965 out of the Second Vatican Council, and the amazingly positive relationship with the Vatican and the Jewish people and the state of Israel that we have today, in which, in the words of a late colleague of mine, Jeffrey Wiggoder, not only is the Catholic Church no longer part of the problem, it's part of the solution. In other words, we took a tactical decision. Yes, there were dangers. Yes, there was the possibility of us being exploited, of being used as a fig leaf, but we understood that the advantages, the potential advantage, was so much greater than the dangers that we had to take that calculated risk. It's the same with regards to the Muslim world today. Not everybody out there is hunky-dory and is nice and cuddly. There are lots of very dangerous elements there. And even in engagements with some of the institutions and some of the countries that we are engaged with, it's not a simple matter. But we have to take a calculated risk, because if we don't engage, we will not be able to change, and we will miss the boat, and that will affect our own particular interests and our own particular goals. And therefore the need to be able to be courageous, to be able to stand up to the criticism and take the necessary calculated risks, I think, is the most important lesson of our success with regards to the Christian world. And as I said earlier, the truth of the matter is that a relationship that is poisoned by politics is actually a much easier relationship to advance than one that is fundamentally poisoned by theology. And that's the big difference between those two relationships. Basically, Islam has a positive attitude towards both Christianity and Judaism. Obviously, it's not without its problematic characters, and there are aspects that need to be addressed, but it can't be compared to the chronic delegitimization that existed within the Christian world. So that's a fundamental difference. And that means that if and when there is political transformation, the change can be dramatic. And until then, we need to work to facilitate that for the morning after, when that dramatic change will be part of reality.
Thank you. We have one final question from Joel Greenberg, who's asking, how do you judge the effectiveness of your work? Are there metrics that you use?
That's a very wonderful question, because the truth of the matter is that conventional metrics simply cannot assess the significance and the impact of our work, because our work above all has to do with changing minds and hearts, and it's an educational process. But we can see certain indications of how those changes are taking place. We can see, for example, even the area of textbooks, which is one of the issues I've now raised with Saudi Arabia, where AJC already did a study almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago, was one of the first to be able to highlight this particular issue. And we can see where there have been changes. There have been changes. There's still more things that need to be done. But perhaps most dramatic are the textbooks within Jordan, or even certain areas of Tunisia, where we can see changes have taken place in no small part as a result of constructive engagement with those particular institutions, with those countries, with the religious leadership, and above all, with their own educational authorities. So that's just one area where we can see it, but the greatest demonstration is the degree to which today Muslim religious leadership wants to engage us. Now, there are all ways to explain that, and there are very many different issues and interests at play. However, it is perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of the fact that the situation has changed, is changing at any rate, and that is in no small part due to the systematic engagement, and particularly that AJC has had, both through its diplomatic outreach, through our governmental work, through our ongoing relationships with countries in the region, and through our unique interreligious trailblazing initiatives.
Thank you, Rabbi. That concludes the question portion. Do you have any concluding remarks?
My remarks are only to spread the good word, because as I said at the beginning, the good word doesn't get out easily. And there's a lot of skepticism, and skepticism is not without its justification. But we have achieved an enormous amount, and we live in a remarkable time of unique opportunities. And just getting that word out is in itself really important.
Thank you. I also want to thank our AJC community for joining us today, as well as our partners at Jewish Insider. In addition, AJC is encouraging and highlighting acts of kindness during the current crisis as part of its newly launched Be a Mensch campaign Visit ajc.org/beamensch, that's BEAMENSCH, to submit your own story of menschy behavior, or share it on social media using the hashtag #BeAMensch. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you and goodbye.